The origin of this talk started probably about 30 years ago. Dick Goodrich, who's a member of Trinity Church and a retired English teacher, said, "Jane, wasn't there like famous authors that came to Branford?" And I hadn't really thought much about it. And he says, "You should do a talk." So I did a talk many years ago, very informally, to the Half Hour Reading Club. And this is a member of the Half Hour Reading Club. I don't know who she is, I don't know her name, but this was celebrating their 40th anniversary in 1940. And the book must have been very sad that they were reading, I guess. And all I can say is we've come a long way, baby. And what we're going to talk about this evening is people who lived either year-round in Branford or visited in Branford, primarily between the 1900 to World War II era into the 50s. I'm going to mention a couple more recent, just because they've maybe just deceased in the last couple years, just as a quick mention. And we're going to do this sort of geographically, as I often do with my talks, starting in Short Beach, where my family's been since 1900, so I tend to know a little more about the goings-ons here. And so the authors coming to Branford sort of coincide with that ending part of Branford being a summer resort. And part of Branford being a summer resort was the postcards. I know of about 3,000 postcards that were printed in Branford from all areas of Branford, and so I'm going to use a few of these scenes and give you kind of the flavor of what Branford was like during this period. And so why did some of these people come to Short Beach? Well, Short Beach, like today, it's really quite beautiful. There's nice beaches, it's a lovely view, but in Short Beach, famous people could come and no one bothered them. And that's sort of like today. We don't bother each other unless there's a hurricane, and then we all seem to come out and help. But you could be discreet in Short Beach if you were famous. And where did they come? Well, Branford, Short Beach had a couple little hotels, but the only year-round hotel was the Arrowhead. And the Arrowhead was built in 1911, and when they were digging the cellar, they found Indian arrowheads. And so the name of the hotel was suggested by the famous poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox, and that's how it got its name, the Arrowhead. This building still exists today without the pillars, and it's an apartment building which all of us that grew up in Short Beach still call the Arrowhead. But this is where, being the only year-round hotel with the new inventions called steam heat, where some of these people came. So the first one we're going to talk about, if you might remember, part of putting this talk together, it was really quite nostalgic for me because most of these personalities were alive in my teenage years and well into my early adulthood, so it was very reminiscent for me and nostalgic. So the first one, of course, here is Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell was born in 1897 in New York City. He was a journalist, broadcaster, columnist, and he started with the New York Daily newspaper, the New York Daily Mirror, in 1929. And he was the first U.S. syndicated columnist, and primarily as a gossip columnist. And his column was on Broadway, so he was in the know of everything that was going on. He could be very cryptic. He became very, very popular very, very quickly. He was on the radio in 1930 on WABC in New York. He was controversial, as one would think a gossip columnist might be. There was rumor that he had some friendships with gangsters, but he was also a very close friend of J. Edgar Hoover. He was a huge supporter of FDR and very anti-Nazi. So he had all these facets. He became even more famous during the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, where he PR'd much of that. At the height of his career, he was syndicated in 2,000 newspapers across the country and had 50 million daily readers around the world. He was also an avid for civil rights. Long before it was sometimes popular both for women and African Americans. And then when his career started to slow down because of political changes in the country, he narrated The Untouchables on TV. And I'd like to just, he had loads of sayings that could be attributed to him. Again, he had quite a caustic tongue. But some of the fun ones, I thought, the same thing happened today that happened yesterday, only to different people. You've heard that. Gossip is the art of saying nothing in a way that leaves practically nothing unsaid. Hollywood is a place where they put you under contract, where in essence they really should put you under observation. And he had a lot of those kinds of little cryptic sayings. Another visitor to the Arrowhead was Sinclair Lewis, another author, of course, and we'll be talking about him a little bit later. Another person who visited the Arrowhead and stayed there was Jack London, and we'll be mentioning him in just a moment also. But in addition to authors, these hotels and the shoreline also attracted other artists, actors, actresses, dancers, and the like. And someday I think I need to do a talk on actors who came to Branford, because that's pretty fun. And don't forget, some of this period is before, in the early 1900s till World War I, no radio, no television. And so this was a place for these people to come and relax. And what did they do? This is the assembly hall at the Arrowhead, the sort of living room. And so after a dinner, a walk down to the beach, you'd come back, there'd be piano playing, people would sing impromptu, there'd be poetry readings. Some of the local artists would set up little studios and sell their paintings. So this gives you a little flavor of what people were doing in the early 1900s when they came not just to Short Beach, but the other summer resort areas. Another location where people came that were famous is not really even Branford, but it's East Haven, and that was Nellie Green's. We like to think it's really in Short Beach, but it really isn't. And this was a long-time tavern. It was a hard scrabble place. It was where sailors hung out. And Nellie Green, the famous proprietor of the tavern, this is her when she was 16. She was an only child, and her father was, after the Civil War, somewhat incapable, and she took over the tavern at a fairly young age. She is famous, not certainly as an author, but as a rum runner, among other things, and that's certainly another story that's worth telling. But one of her dear friends and frequent visitor was indeed Jack London. And you can, if you remember a little something about Jack London, the Nellie Green's would be his kind of place. A sailor's hangout, a place where you could have a drink, right on the water, etc. Yeah.
He's quite gorgeous.
And he really was, yeah. He was born in 1876, and he spent several summers at Nellie Green's, and he became immensely famous. He was already getting famous in 1903 when he published Call of the Wild. And he probably wrote, the locals always said he did quite a bit of writing when he was at Nellie Green's in 1903, and then in 1904 published Seawolf, another one of his famous books. He was a novelist, an essayist. He wrote short stories. He was a journalist at the newspaper. He was also a social activist for civil rights, women's rights, and so on. And he was really the first famous magazine fiction writer during this period. And if you've read anything about Jack London, he had a very rough and tumble childhood. Parents that divorced, and he was kind of pushed around from parent to parent. Early in his 20s, he was a sailor to the Orient for several years. He went to the gold rush in the 1890s. He had a first marriage that failed, and then a very successful second marriage to Charmaine Kittredge. And there always was a rumor, I always thought he died of alcoholism, but in fact he died at the age of 40 from kidney disease. And think what he would have written had he lived a longer life. There were others that came to Nellie Green's. This is another picture of Jack London, of course. Not just authors, but musicians and actors. Rudy Vallee, Tyrone Power, John Barrymore, Bing Crosby, just to name a few. And the famous people and regular middle-class people didn't just stay at the hotels. In Short Beach, Indian Neck especially, there were little cottages you could rent. And this is a little cottage on what was called Bradley Street. It's now called Court Street in Short Beach. And this little cottage to this day is called Sleepy Hollow, which I think is quite a nice literary title for a cottage. And there were a couple people, authors, that stayed in this cottage. One was Orson Welles. And we'll be speaking about him in more depth a little bit later, but he stayed at the Sleepy Hollow when he was a student at the Yale Drama School.
I've never seen him that thin.
No, exactly, yeah. Well, this is a really young picture. Less well known, but nonetheless certainly a prolific author, and someone my grandmother knew quite well, was Carlton Beals. He was born in 1893, and he summered quite a number of years at Sleepy Hollow. He also summered at Brocken's Point and lived at Brocken's Point year-round, and ultimately lived also in Sacham's Head and Killingworth. He was a Connecticut native. He was a journalist, a historian, and particularly known as a crusader for rights of Latin American countries. He wrote over 45 books, including some local histories. He wrote a history of New Haven, over 200 articles in various magazines, Harper's, The New Republic, Vogue, and so on. Again, he was known during his lifetime as an advocate of civil rights in the Latin and South American countries, and he was a hero to young men in Cuba for his writings. He received many, many awards during his lifetime. Short Beach's most famous resident and author was the poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox. And maybe some of you don't know of her today, but she was internationally famous during her life. She was born in 1850 in Wisconsin to Vermont parents who were not very rich and not very successful. And she obviously was very talented and started writing at the age of 5, poetry, and by the age of 12 was actively publishing in various magazines and supporting her family. She came to Short Beach in 1891. She was already internationally famous, and she built on a promenade of rock two homes, and she lived in Short Beach the rest of her life year-round. She made Short Beach famous during its day, and her whole complex, which was called Bungalow Court, was the center of social and cultural activities for the region. She wrote over 70 books of poetry, many of them multiple reprints of them, and hundreds of poems and essays in magazines throughout the world. Her most famous book was in 1883, so before she came to Short Beach, and it was called Poems of Passion. And several publishers refused to publish it because of its title. She said it was passion for life. It was not just a sexual innuendo, but a passion for life and so on. And she became instantly famous. This sold thousands and thousands of copies. It's been republished over 12 times. And probably her most famous poem is from that book, Poems of Passion, and it's called Solitude. Laugh and the world laughs with you. Weep and you weep alone. For the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but has trouble enough of its own. Sigh, it is lost on the air, the echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from voices' care. Rejoice, and men will seek you, grieve, and they turn and go. They want full measure of all your pleasure, but they do not need your woe. And it continues on, and I'm sure all of you have heard that famous poem. That poem is used extensively today, and her other poems are on greeting cards, for example, so her work is still being published. We probably have the second largest collection of Ella Wheeler Wilcox memorabilia here between Blackstone and Branford Historical Society, including a lot of her books, which you certainly can come in and peruse through the reference department. Again, her home this is the bungalow. It's her summer home on the water, and I look out my front window every day to look at this house. It was built by Richard Bradley of Montowese Street here in Branford, and he built all her properties, as he did other buildings. And it was a gathering place not just for authors, but poets, artists, musicians, actors, and dancers. One of the highlights of her life was in 1901 when William Randolph Hearst asked her to go to England to cover the funeral of Queen Victoria and to note her observations of that event. And she decided, even before she went, that she really wanted to write a poem for the occasion, but she had writer's block, which she really very often did not have writer's block. And so in about a half an hour the morning of the funeral, when she looked out her hotel window and saw the mass of people all dressed in black and the purple drapes from all the buildings, that she wrote this poem, and I'm just going to read you a bit of it. And it's called The Queen's Last Ride. The Queen is taking a drive today. They have hung with purple the carriageway. They have dressed with purple the royal track, where the Queen goes forth and never comes back. Army and Navy shall lead the way for that wonderful coach of the Queen today. Kings and princes and lords of the land shall ride behind her, a humble band. And over the city and over the world shall the flags of all nations be half-mast furled, for the silent lady of royal birth who is riding away from the courts of earth, riding away from the world's unrest to a mystical goal on a secret quest. And the poem continues. And so that was published all over the world as a lasting tribute to Queen Victoria. Among Ella Wheeler Wilcox's dear friends was a small group of women who were her friends for several decades. Famous in their day, not so much now, but one was the author Julia Opp Haversham, and she was the author of several books, including Squaw Men. She was a poet. She was also an actress and married to a famous actor at that time, William Faversham from England, and they honeymooned at the bungalow when they married. Among her other friends, this is Ella in the middle, was another author, Theodosia Garrison, or also known as Theodosia Pickering. She was a poet. The other author is Kate Jordan, who was a close friend of hers, and another part of her circle, though not an author, was Ruth St. Denis. And you may not know her today, but she is considered the founder of the modern dance movement in the United States, very famous during her time, and her husband taught all the famous modern dancers during the 20th century. Another friend and someone she collaborated with was the author Ruth Helen Davis, and this is Ella with Ruth, and they were writing the lyrics to a new march called Victory, and the music was by John Philip Sousa. And we didn't know until recently, when we've done research on the poet, that she wrote lyrics to over 12 pieces of music and also wrote some plays. Other people who came to the bungalow, among others, Sarah Bernhardt, the actress, John Barrymore, Edgar Allan Poe. Ella was married. She met her husband, Robert Wilcox, who was a native of Meriden, and they met at a jewelry store in Wisconsin. He was a salesman. And they traveled extensively, but always made Short Beach their home. And this is a picture of them in Jamaica on vacation, and they were vacationing with Jack London and his wife Charmaine, and they were very close friends. Robert Wilcox died suddenly of pneumonia in 1916 at the bungalow, and after his death, Ella was extremely distraught over his death and decided to go to Europe to help and talk to the soldiers during World War I. And she was never really well after that, and she died in 1919 at the bungalow, and they had one child who died as an infant, and they did not have any children. One of her male close friends was the author Edwin Markham. He was born in 1852, and he was an author, a poet, an educator, and a frequent visitor to the bungalow, and he did the funeral at the bungalow when Ella died. and he was well known around Shore Beach. And they were both cremated, and their ashes they drilled a rock at the bungalow, and their ashes are in the rock at the bungalow with a little plaque over it. Quite a number of years after Ella's death, another author came to Shore Beach to write a biography of the poet, and her name was Jenny Ballou, and she stayed right on my street for 2 parts of 2 years, right to the house next door to me. And she had become somewhat known before she came to Shore Beach for this one book, Spanish Prelude, which had some national publicity. And so she came to Shore Beach and interviewed a lot of Shore Beachers that knew the poet, and she wrote a biography of the poet called Period Piece. And then she kind of got run out of town because the Shore Beachers didn't like the way that she spoke about Ella. She spoke about her in a little bit of a derogatory way, so we like to say she got run out of town. And she doesn't appear that she wrote anything else. It's just those 2 books. Another person who stayed in Shore Beach a little later period was a man named Sam Bird, and he was an author. This was his first book in 1942 called Small Town South. It was made into a movie, was also on Broadway, and he wrote quite a number of other books. He also wrote plays, and then toward the end of his life he was a professor after serving in World War II. He was a major in the Navy in World War II. And he was also a Broadway actor, most noted for his performance as Dude Lester in Tobacco Road, and he performed that 1,100 times consecutively without a break, and holds the Broadway, at that time, held the Broadway record for most consecutive performances. And he came as part of the permanent cast of the Stony Creek Theater in the early 1940s as an actor. And it just so happened that my grandmother was editor of the Branford Review, and I didn't know this until a couple months ago, my father told me that she had a group of Stony Creek Theater, like a little club, and they would go down to the theater to see all the plays, and then she would review them for the Branford Review. And she became quite a close friend of Sam Bird and corresponded with him, and so that's why he stayed in Shore Beach, because of that connection. Another year-round author in Shore Beach, you didn't know all this, did you, that there was all these people, was a man named Otis Klein, and he lived on what was then called Main Street, it's now called Shore Drive, and his granddaughter still lives in the house. And he was what was called an adventure novelist, and then later became a literary agent, and this is called the pulp fiction era. Tarzan, spaceships going to Mars, all those kinds of magazine serials became very popular during this time. This is one of his books. Isn't this a fantastic cover? The Prince of Peril. So this is during this era. He wrote over a dozen books, Tarzan-type books, again, going to Mars. And then he stopped his writing career and became a literary agent. And he was one of his clients was Robert Howard, who was the author of the Conan the Barbarian series. Another author from Shore Beach who stayed and lived in Shore Beach for quite a number of years and later had a home on South Main Street was Hazel Langdale. And she was born in 1889. She was the English teacher at Branford High School for 24 years. She retired in 1952. Her husband, Robert, was the English teacher at Hill House in New Haven, and their daughter, Barbara Barker, who was the English teacher at Branford High, was when I was at Branford High School. So everyone my age had Barbara Barker as an English teacher. And Miss Langdale, in addition to her teaching English, was the author of 6 preteen books through the 1930s and 1940s. The last author I want to mention from Shore Beach, though more recent, is Feemy Ziner, who just died 2 months ago. And she lived in Shore Beach for 25 years. She was a professor of English at UConn and the author of more than a dozen books and many articles and essays in magazines. Her most famous book is Squanto, which is the tale of a Native American woman who helped the Pilgrims, but she has, as I mentioned, over a dozen books. One is Within This Wilderness, which talks about her oldest son who moved to the wilderness of Alaska and her relationship with him after he moved and so on. And another of her books is A Full House. She had two children, and then she had triplets. So she tells about what it's like to be a parent to 5 children, 3 of whom are triplets. Well, I think we'll now scoot on over to Stony Creek. And you can well imagine that Stony Creek attracted quite a number of famous people, and it's really all because of the theater. The Stony Creek Theater was built in 1914 by the Howd family of Stony Creek as a silent movie theater. And then in 1928, the amateur acting group, the Parish Players from Stony Creek, who were starting to gain quite a good reputation as an amateur acting group, took over the theater in 1928. So it was the Parish Player House for about 3 years. And it is at this Parish Player Theater that the national premiere of Death Takes a Holiday, the play, which was later a movie, premiered in Stony Creek under the tutelage of the Schubert brothers in 1929. The Parish Players kind of dissolved in 1931, and that's when Stony Creek Theater became really a summer stock theater with a gaining reputation, and then attracted more famous people and actors that came to the theater. This was summer stock. It was not open during the winter. It was open in July, August, and into September. And I'm going to do sort of the people that came here chronologically. And one of them, you might remember her, is Ayn Rand. She was not that well known when she came to Stony Creek. She was born in 1905 in the Soviet Union, what was then Russia, of course, an author, political activist. And when I was doing this program, I realized how she was in the news all the time when I was probably a teenager. I mean, she really was very famous for her activism and political views. She stayed at a house on Halls Point for 2 summers, certainly did some writing there, and this is when Stony Creek Theater was becoming more famous and New York actors were starting to come to do summer stock in Stony Creek. In the season of 1936, she wrote only 2 or 3 plays in addition to her books, and one of her first plays was called Night of January 16th, and that was shown at the Stony Creek Theater in 1936, and she was living in Stony Creek that summer and helped with the production of her play. And that was a novel play in that there was a crime, and then the audience was the jury. So every night there was a different verdict and a different outcome. So people went every night because they wanted to see what the next group of people would do. Her husband's name was Frank O'Connor, and he was quite a good actor and also a good artist, and he was in the permanent cast of the Stony Creek Theater for those 2 summers, which is why she came. During her time here, we believe she wrote, and she also published that second summer, her first book, We the Living, and it was not successful, but it's had a resurgence, and there's a resurgence of her popularity with young people today. And of course, she became hugely famous with The Fountainhead in 1943 and Atlas Shrugged in 1957. Her movie, actually, Night of January 16th, later went to Broadway and was a 1941 movie. She died in 1982. And I told you we'd get back to Orson Welles. Orson Welles was only 23 when he came to Stony Creek, and this would be 1938. And he was already gaining a lot of popularity in New York for plays, particularly Shakespeare plays with a different slant. He had, of course, a fantastic voice. And in 1937, he put together the Mercury Players, which became a very famous acting group. Perhaps you even remember them today, or you're familiar with them. So it was only the second year of their existence that the Mercury Players of New York became the permanent theater actors in Stony Creek for the whole summer of 1938. think about, you know, the locals of Stony Creek. You've got these famous New York actors coming, and the Mercury Players are staying in your house, some of them, or staying in the local hotel. One of the plays that Orson Welles put on, which became very famous, was Too Much Johnson. And that was written by William Gillette, and that would be the same William Gillette of Gillette's Castle on the Connecticut River. And you can see that it was produced and directed by Orson Welles, and in the cast were the Mercury Players from New York. Edgar Barrier, you might remember him as an actor, I certainly do, as a young adult and teenager. Anna Stafford was Orson Welles' first wife. She was in the permanent cast. How about Joseph Cotton? How famous was he in multiple movies? And Ruth Ford in dozens and dozens of movies during you know, my childhood and adulthood. Another one that was in the Mercury Players for many years, not as well known, was Erskine Sanford. So again, think about what it was like for Branford people. People came from New York. They were staying at the hotels to come to this theater to see Orson Welles, who, you know, little did they know how famous he would be. And this sold out every single night. They had to add new nights to the performance, and it received high praise in the press in New York. Orson Welles directed most of the plays that summer, stayed the whole summer, and then the season in Stony Creek was over in September, and October 30th of that same year, 1938, he had a radio broadcast, which of course is very famous, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which a large part of people in the United States thought we were being invaded by Mars. And then of course he was famous in the Campbell Playhouse as the Shadow, and then he went on to Hollywood for many years. This is in 1941, only a few years after he was in Stony Creek, Citizen Kane, and you can see the actors. This was still the Mercury Players that went to Hollywood and followed Orson Welles, Joseph Cotton. We have Ruth Warwick, Erskine Sanford again. And so I talked about where these actors, this is a whole troupe of actors, 12 in number usually, from New York. They would stay at private homes, but they would also stay primarily here at the Flying Point Hotel. And this was also called Island View, right on Flying Point Avenue in Stony Creek. And they basically took over the hotel. They had their rehearsals here, and they stayed here, had their meals here, and so on. This hotel was torn down after the theater closed, and it was torn down in 1942. I want to just go back to Ayn Rand. I forgot to mention something. A longtime Stony Creek person who now lives in Florida, and he's in his 90s, he lived next door where Ayn Rand stayed when she was here, and he said she was very bizarre. And she'd walk, you know, she always had these, you know, elaborate clothing, and he just says no one knew who she was, and she'd go walking up and down the street, and he remembers it to this day. No one had any idea who she was in Stony Creek. Sinclair Lewis was born in 1885, and by the time he came to Stony Creek in the 1941 season, he was internationally famous. In 1930, he was the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature. He would, for Elmer Gantry, and he would also win the Pulitzer Prize. By the time he came to Stony Creek in 1941, he was an alcoholic and very volatile in his behavior. He decided toward this period of his life, middle age, that he would start doing summer stock theater. And he started that in 1937, and so came to Stony Creek in 1941. His play, which he wrote, he did write quite a few plays, My Dear Children, premiered in Stony Creek at the theater, but instead of directing it, he wanted to act in it. So he was the star of this play. And many people, of course, attended the play because he was such a famous person. And there was some controversy, which I'll tell you about. The play wasn't that good. And so in the local newspaper here in Branford, the play starred Marcel Powers, Sam Bird, who was in the permanent cast. We've already talked about Sam. Ruth Altman, who was really a very popular actress during her day, and Cordelia Clark, and somebody named, this is before you had to put your name on an editorial, so SBC is the person who wrote this editorial. I haven't tried to figure out, wrote an editorial in the Branford Review stating he did not like the play and thought Sinclair Lewis was boring. And so this got picked up by Walter Winchell in New York. And so Walter Winchell put it in his gossip column, which, if you remember, went to 2,000 papers and 50 million people. And Walter Winchell wrote in his column that Sinclair Lewis is playing and starring in Dear Children in the Sticks. So, of course, Lewis realized the play didn't turn out very well, but he blamed the dopes, this is quoted from Winchell, he blamed the dopes in Stony Creek for not understanding the punchlines. So you can imagine this continues, so it was sort of a war of words. And so another person in the local paper wrote, this person now is R.E.L., wrote, he took great offense to the remarks and the insult and noted that the audience was sold out to see this famous author whose books they had all read. But this R.E.L. says, but, in quotes, by now, Mr. Lewis, we must confess that as an off-actor you reek. And so the editorial goes on to explain how the Stony Creek audience is made up of all intelligent, very experienced theater goers, many summer people, New Yorkers, and so on. So despite all this controversy, which must have been really fun, the director for the summer stock theater that year convinced Sinclair Lewis to stay for the rest of the summer. And in fact, he wrote another play that showed in Stony Creek that summer, was called Angela 22, but this time Sinclair Lewis decided he better direct instead of act. And this was much more popular. It was about a young woman named Angela, who was 22 years old, that was seeing a man in his 50s and all that entails. And it starred Marcella Powers, who was the lead star during the Stony Creek Theater. Well, and Sam Bird was also in that cast. And you might be able to guess that Marcella Powers was the 22-year-old Angela, and that Sinclair Lewis was the man in his 50s. And an internet search, there are some letters in a university archives here in the United States, but none of the internet stuff seems to be convinced that it was really Marcel Powers that was having an affair with him, but that he was infatuated with her. So it's not totally clear-cut whether that was a mutual relationship. But nonetheless, Sinclair Lewis didn't need much convincing to stay in Stony Creek that summer because she was there the whole summer. He also directed in both Stony Creek and Broadway another play that he wrote called The Good Neighbor. And The Good Neighbor was bought by Sam Bird, who then brought it to Broadway, and on Broadway it starred Marcella Powers. So this has been kind of fun researching this stuff. Sinclair Lewis died in 1951, less than 10 years after he was in Stony Creek. There were one more year at Stony Creek. The Stony Creek Theater's last season, its 20th season, was 1942, and because of the war, people were doing other things. A lot of the actors had enlisted or been drafted. There was a gasoline shortage, and it just was not viable anymore to have this kind of frivolity when a war was going on, and so the theater closed. But in its last season, there were other plays. One was called Blind Alley by the author James Warwick, and he attended several of the performances, and he co-authored with Agatha Christie, Tommy and Tuppence series, and also The Pink Pearl Affair. So he was the co-author of those two books with Agatha Christie. A few more recent authors in Stony Creek not associated, well, the first one is associated with the theater, and that is Andre Smith. He's to your left, and to the right is his dear friend and manager, Attilio Banca. And Andre Smith was a prolific artist, and that's what he's primarily known for. This is at his research studio, art studio in Florida. And his home, Marsh House in Stony Creek, is on the marsh by the baseball field and still owned by the Banker family. But I mention him because he was the set designer for the Parish Players at the Stony Creek Theater. He designed all their sets. And because of that, he ended up being an author of 3 books. One in 1928 was the book The Screenwright, and this was the Bible at this time for little playhouses across the country on how to build your theater sets. So he combined that artistic talent with being an author. Toward the end of his career, he also wrote another book which was called The Art and the Subconscious. And most of his art are etchings, beautiful etchings of Europe, also in this country, of Stony Creek and local scenes. But he also got into Cubism and modern art, and so this is a lot of what the art is in that book. It's, you know, kind of weird stuff, art and the subconscious. So just to mention that sometimes these actors and actresses were also authors. A little more recently, another author from Stony Creek was Arthur Wythus. He was born in 1911, and he was mostly noted as an illustrator and artist, but he was in World War II, and he was the first editor and illustrator of Yank magazine, which of course was the magazine for the soldiers during World War II. And then he had a very prolific and long career, largely in the cosmetic industry as an illustrator for cosmetics and magazine ads and so on. But he collaborated with James Jones in Jones's books, World War II, and of course Jones is most famous for his book, Here to Eternity. And then Arthur Wythus in 1992 published his own book about his memories and the memories of the other editors and writers from Yank magazine about World War II. One other mention of a Stony Creek author and playwright was Mira Resnick. She died in 1995. She was a playwright and author. One of her plays and a book also is Any Wednesday. I'm sure you've heard of that. It was a movie you can see with Jane Fonda and Jason Robards. And her other book was Life Without Father. We're going to end our talk in Indian Neck. And I don't know if anyone's here from Pine Orchard, but I don't really know about any authors in Pine Orchard during this period. If anyone does, please let me know, but they certainly did come to Indian Neck. And the reason they came was a couple reasons. One was the Owenego, and that was a long time the only Branford summer hotel still in operation, and largely because of its owner, Cornelius Driscoll. He was known as Connie Driscoll, and he was the recently late Jane Rosenthal's first husband. He was an attorney, and he was a very good friend and dear friend of the author on your right, Eric Ramacu, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the famous author of the 1929 book All Quiet on the Western Front, and then The Arch of Triumph. And in 1958, the author married Pauline Goddard, the famous actress, in Branford by Connie Driscoll, who married them in a very quiet wedding. This was her fourth husband. She was married second to Charlie Chaplin and third to Meredith Burgess, the actor, and then she had several more husbands after that, and I lost track of them. They weren't married very long, but just gives you a flavor of the people were coming to Branford. But they primarily came because of the Montowese House. And the Montowese House was built in 1865 by the Bryan family, and it was run by that family for 98 years continuously when it closed in 1963. And then also in 1939, after the 38 hurricane, when over 200 trees fell on their property, they had the trees milled on site and built the Montowese Playhouse, which was a summer stock theater that ran into the late 1960s. And to this theater came authors, playwrights, and pretty famous actors and actresses during the 40s and 50s. But the Montowese was the largest hotel between New London and New York with 200 rooms. And so there was lots to do, beautiful views. There was always the bathhouses, the beach. There was boating, a wonderful dock with a diving board, golf, horseback riding, tennis, croquet, fantastic food, dancing. it was really a hot spot during its day. And so I'm going to mention some of the authors that came to the Montowese House. One you might not know is, his name is Thorne Smith, and he came many summers to the Montowese House. A lot of families would come for the entire summer. They'd bring their maids, by stagecoach they'd come, and the family would spend the whole summer, and the man of the family would commute into New York City, for example, or to New Britain or Hartford to work, but the family would stay at the Montowese. And this was a similar situation here. So Thorne Smith was familiar with the hotel, spent most of his childhood here during the summer, and was a regular visitor even when he was in college. And he was a close friend and even dated Lydia Bryan on your left. And the Bryan family said he set the standard for merriment at the Montowese. He was an author. He went to Dartmouth, and he was the author of over a dozen books, even though he died at the age of 41 from alcoholism. So often these people had problems in that regard, but these were humorous, sexual innuendo, fantasy fiction books. He covered the gamut, but he is most famous for his series of books called the Topper series. And you've probably heard of those. They were made into 3 different movies, and these books sold like 10 million copies. So he was certainly very famous in his day. Another author visitor to the Montowese House, though again becoming famous when she first came, was Dorothy Parker. And I again forgot how kind of famous she was during my childhood and early adulthood. She was born in 1893. She was a poet, a writer. She wrote short stories. She was a critic, and she was a screen critic and a screenwriter and playwright. And she was most famous for her wisecracks and wit, and the spontaneous wit. Some of them I can't, it's not really proper for me to say what she said, but some of these I can tell you. She started the phrase, which we're all very familiar with, beauty is only skin deep, but ugly goes straight to the bone. If you do not know what God thinks of money, just look at the people he gave it to. The first thing I do in the morning is brush my teeth and sharpen my tongue. I hate writing, but I love having written. And then she had, I don't know much about being a millionaire, but I bet I'd be darling at it. So she had, you know, not only was she famous and had this wit and was in the newspaper all the time, she has been the theme of 2 plays, a movie, and other books that have centered around her life. So she continued to be famous after she died in 1967. She wrote for magazines, newspapers, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Vogue. She received 2 Academy Awards, and she wrote the script for A Star is Born and became a dear friend of Barbra Streisand. She wrote over 300 poems. So you forget how famous and prolific these people were. One of the authors and playwrights whose work was at the Montowese Playhouse, and it's a little more recent, is Horton Foote. And you might not know him. He has Branford, not Branford connections, but Connecticut connections, because the Foote family came to Wethersfield when it was founded. He was born in 1916, and he wrote dozens of books, movies, and plays, mostly about life in the United States. He won a Pulitzer Prize, 2 Academy Awards, and he wrote the screenplay To Kill a Mockingbird, just as one example. And then later in life, in more recent years, he was the voice of Jefferson Davis in the PBS series on the Civil War. And he just died in 2009 at the age of like 90. Another person to come to the Montowese House was Helen Keller. And I'm not going to repeat, of course, her whole story, because you all know about her. Again, and I had to reminisce in my childhood, she was in the news all the time for her speeches and her newspaper articles and so on. She was born in 1880, and she was the first deaf and blind person in the country to receive a college degree. And she went on to author more than a dozen books, hundreds of essays. She was a political activist and lecturer, widely published, and she published, among other things, in 1903, her autobiography, The Story of My Life, and then in 1908, The World I Live In. But she was primarily known as this lecturer and activist. She knew every president starting in 1920 and visited all of them at the White House and was received by all of them and considered FDR to be one of her closest friends. And she received in 1964 from President Johnson the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and she died in 1968. One of her best friends and supporters who helped put her through college is our last famous author, and that would be, of course, Mark Twain, the most famous of all the authors who came to Branford. Not only was he a friend of Helen Keller, but he was an very close personal friend of the people who ran the Montowese House, so he stayed at the Montowese House. He was born in 1835, and of course he was the master of humor and humorous speech. But people don't always know he was an ardent supporter of women's rights, of civil rights, and so on. I mentioned he was a personal friend of William Bryant, who's on your right, and there's Mark Twain on the left having some beverage during the summer, and they were played tennis together. Mark Twain loved to play tennis. And he spent quite a bit of time, summers, in the later part of his life, either by himself or with his wife and daughters. And he was here so frequently, he had a custom-made galvanized tub installed in his private room at the Montowese House, 6 feet long, so he could take his baths. You know the story of Mark Twain. He was born on the day that Halley's Comet was seen in the sky, which is every 75 years, and he always said that he would go out when it came again, and that's exactly what he did. He died the day Halley's Comet came back 75 years later in 1910. The Montowese House closed in 1963 after 98 years in continuous operation, and the family saved some of the things out. It was torn down, and the Bryan family saved the galvanized tub. But today, I don't know where that tub is today, but wouldn't it be interesting to know where that is? So thank you so much for coming.